There is a lot of self-isolation, but as I say, sometimes that isolation can actually make encounters, even small encounters, really meaningful, that when you actually do meet with someone, there's a real listening that goes on, a real relating.
Thank you everyone for coming. Our speaker this evening is Professor Graham Ward, who is Emeritus Regius Professor of Divinity at the University of Oxford, an extraordinary professor of systematic theology and ecclesiology at the University of Stellenbosch. Among his many books are Cities of God, Cultural Transformation and Religious Practice, True Religion, Christ and Culture, The Politics of Discipleship, Unbelievable and Unimaginable. For the last decade, he has been working on Ethical Life, a major 4-volume systematic theology, which includes 2 already published volumes entitled How the Light Gets In and Another Kind of Normal, and then the upcoming Salus. On a personal note, I first met Professor Ward at a theology conference in the Netherlands in 2014. As a result of our conversation at that conference, I ended up applying to do my doctoral degree at the University of Oxford, and I had the wonderful opportunity of studying with him for 4 years there. What I've always appreciated about Professor Ward's work is its careful interdisciplinarity, its boldness in insisting on the continued relevance of theology for human life, and its ethical and pastoral attunement. If you read his books, which I encourage you to do, you will find that he seamlessly brings together insights from the natural sciences, theology, philosophy, music theory, critical theory, and gender studies, among many other areas, along with traversing a variety of languages, including Greek, Latin, German, and French. Even more importantly, at least to my mind, Professor Ward insists on implicating himself in his work. So in other words, for him, theology is not just an abstract intellectual exercise, but rather, as he states in Another Kind of Normal, theology is venturing into the incomprehensible. It's a practice of reaching out for what we name God. And this telling of a story that emerges through this process is, quote, an invitation to reimagine the world in all of its dimensions, our place within it, and our responsibilities to it. So we're immensely grateful to have him here with us at Boston College this evening, and please join me now in welcoming him.
Thank you, Megan. And thank you for, I don't know where this invitation came from, but thank you for the invitation. It's a great privilege and honor. And I just enjoy the fact that you trust me enough to sit here and listen to what I've got to say. So I hope that trust is actually warranted. So I want to talk about loneliness. And this is really the beginning of a conversation. It's a prompt towards a conversation. In the West, lots of people, there are seats down here for those people who are standing at the back. There's no need to be standing. But in the West, due to forces and trends, cultural, economic, political, and social, loneliness is rife and it's complex. Research is still trying to catch up with the vast and deepening nature of the phenomenon. So I'm only throwing into the conversation my own 2 pennies worth. And I want to make it clear now to dampen any kind of expectations. I will not be proposing any answers. But in this exploration of loneliness, I want you to hold on to 2 sentences. The first is from Scripture and the prophet Isaiah. I have called you by name, you are mine. And the second is from a classic American novel by Carson McCullers, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. And you'll see why I'm asking you to hold on to these as we proceed. But why have I wanted to speak about this topic? Because it's not an obvious theological topic, though it is certainly a pastoral issue. In the UK last year, there was a nationally declared Loneliness Awareness Week from June the 10th to June the 16th, and this will be repeated this year from June the 9th to June the 15th. And Sundays have been put in there so that churches might offer some reflections. Loneliness is a growing sociological issue, and some have even called it a pandemic, a contagious disease. The figures in the UK are indicative. The headlines read, 16 to 29-year-olds are twice as likely as those over 70 to experience loneliness. 2/5 of all older people, about 3.9 million, say the television is their main company. And long-term loneliness is one of the largest health concerns we have. It's as harmful as obesity or smoking 15 cigarettes a day. Feeling lonely can lead to depression, anxiety, disrupted sleep and stress. It can also be a factor in heart disease, increased blood pressure, and degenerative brain diseases such as Alzheimer's. According to a review of significant books on loneliness done last year for the Times Literary Supplement and entitled Solitary Confinement, this is a quote, nearly half US adults report experiencing loneliness daily. Now, I am not about to embark upon some sociological analysis for why there is so much loneliness, at least in the West. Like, for example, the breakdown of the family and any sense of belonging. Nor am I going to go into the philosophical causes such as hyper-individualism, existentialism, explorations of otherness and difference, which have been mentioned as being causes. And I'm not going to be saying anything about some of the political and economic causes that are thought to be in there, such as neoliberalism and the cult of the entrepreneur. But in a recent cultural study, much is made of the word only gaining currency in the 19th century. Before then, lonely just meant remote, as in the sense of a place, not persons, emerging from the word onlyness. It's defined in that study as an emotion, not a human condition, and as such, culturally and historically structured, and therefore presumably transformable. The book by Faye Bound Alberti is an important one, not least because it shows the complexity and variability of loneliness. No experience of loneliness is the same, and the research is still continuing in how gender, aging, and ethnicity impact differently. Her, Alberti's social construction of loneliness, notes that the word came to be used, and this is her, soon after ideas about sociality and secularism became important to the social and political fabric. Now that's an important observation for a theologian, that association of loneliness with secularism and new forms of social living. Before then, Alberti notes, being alone could be lived and experienced within the framework of a religious narrative. Now, Alberti is resistant to any form of what she calls essentializing loneliness, hence the emphasis on emotions as social constructions. And while I'm certainly not wishing to deny social and cultural impacts on the way loneliness is perceived, lived, and feared, by some. Christian theological anthropology, because of its attention to Christ as both fully God and fully human, embraces certain universalisms about the human condition. And aloneness, I'm going to argue, on theological grounds, is one of them. It is not simply sociopathology arising with industrialized and increasingly urbanized societies and secularization. Though the experiences of being alone, alienated, lacking meaningful social relations with other people, when you have no theological framework for understanding that condition, can have a devastating impact physically and mentally. What then I am attempting in this lecture is to provide that theological framework, recognizing that the appeal of such a framework is no ready solution to the present situation in the West. To embrace the theological framework, it is necessary, as Irenaeus said many centuries ago, to acknowledge that one is created. That's the basic, to have a sensibilitas for God. Nevertheless, while the theological framework offers no ready solution, for the Christian and for the church, the pastoral issue of loneliness is an increasing concern. In part, in addressing this topic theologically, I'm attempting to think through the pastoral issue by examining it in the light of fundamental and systematic theology, questions of anthropology, formation, salvation. And as my reference to Scripture indicates, I wish to offer that exploration from within the context of Sacra Pagina, while, as my reference to Carson McCullough's novel indicates, imaginative explorations of loneliness provide theological reflection with something of an outsider's perspective on a broad cultural context. The issue of loneliness for me takes prominence because of living on my own and living where I live. My home is near the end of a long promontory that forms the Isle of Mull as it reaches out towards the Isle of Iona, islands off the west coast of Scotland. It's a large area bounded by the Atlantic on which around 300 people live permanently. And it's cut off from the rest of the island by mountains and a steep-sided glen through which one single-track road gives entrance and exit. During COVID, when I was isolating there was something of a humorous irony when you met anyone walking a dog on the empty beach. People here have been isolating and self-isolating for centuries. It's a way of life lived in this area and always has been. In fact, most of the people who live there now, who like me have retired there from the mainland, have actively sought such isolation. And please don't be too quick to either spiritualize or romanticize this isolation. There's around 6 hours of grey and grainy light for about 6 months of the year. The wind is merciless, the rain pummels, and the sea grinds. So Celtic twilight takes on a very different set of associations through what is called the Drike, the dark months when you check the tiles on your roof, the dry wood in your shed, and the trees you planted, which are not only staked into the ground, but often roped to the deer fence uprights. But as I said, for many, isolation has been sought here. And that situation raises a question of the difference between loneliness and aloneness. To categorize one state as involuntary and the other voluntary is reductive and only opens further questions. For example, questions about desire and the nature of being human. Questions about space and freedom. For loneliness brings a shrinking of the world, even entrapment. And what attracts people to come and live on Mull is light and openness of landscape. The spectrum between involuntary and voluntary is very broad and reductive when it comes to the complex circumstances in which being alone and feeling alienated occurs. It admits none of the subtleties of wrestling with silence, unbearable, endured, and prized. It admits none of the questions about mental health and the relationships between soul and the spirit, the psychic and the spiritual. Reflect states of reflection, meditation, and contemplation, the relationship between the religious, the sacramental, belief, and non-belief. If church attendance is any register of religious motivations behind the solitude of those on the island of Mull, and I doubt that it is, then very few people are committed to institutional religious faiths. Nevertheless, both states, loneliness and solitude, invite a focus on what Kierkegaard called innerness. For the lonely, this is a condition that feels imposed by a lack of social relations and includes cycles of paranoia. For those who seek solitude, perhaps it's the goal to find a space for self-reflection, to limit or even withdraw from social relations and their concomitant responsibilities. For Kierkegaard, innerness was the only way to move beyond the psychic to the spiritual. But he recognized that the way here led, for him at least, through self-despair. I do not see among the people with whom I self-isolate very much despair, though I recognize chronic loneliness can lead to despair. Frequently, what I see is a certain liberation, usually after very busy and eventful lives, while in fact little is on offer on the island in terms of a church life. I actually discern a spirituality at work here, in and through this self-imposed exile. Spirituality that is along Kierkegaardian lines, an innerness reaching for something more meaningful, more holistic than the psychological aim of finding oneself. But as I said, nature is often elemental and raw, and illusions about the beauties of the natural world get stripped back in a storm. At this point, I want to make two caveats. First, I should make it plain that what I will not be advocating is that people who genuinely feel the alienations of loneliness, even to the point of despair, should simply pull themselves together and take this as an opportunity to come to Christ. What I want is to engage in a theological and anthropological reflection, not to preach a sermon. We are complex creatures. Our needs are highly individual and various. To negotiate the world, whether as a Christian or not, requires degrees of self-confidence and self-respect. Many, if not all people, walk a thin line between trying to maintain levels of confidence and self-respect in a world that makes high demands, spins endless myths about successful living, promotes levels of expectation from those who seek to belong and be accepted, and is increasingly subject to the unpredictable. Loneliness is a social pathology, but its causes are manifold and intricate. And I would not like to suggest that Christians can't get lonely, or, God forbid, that loneliness is a sin. Many here might remember Leonard Cohen's marvelous song, The Sisters of Mercy, and the lines, "Yes, you who must leave everything that you cannot control. It begins with your family, but soon it comes round to your soul. Well, I've been where you're hanging, and I can see where you're pinned. When you're not feeling holy, your loneliness says that you've sinned." I've often been struck by Leonard Cohen's poetic insight here, the guilt and shame of loneliness, which views it as a sin and begins with a sense of a demand to be always in control. And yet it's exactly control that is required to walk that thin line of self-confidence and self-respect in a world that presents any number of situations in which each of us can be rocked to the core. The guilt and shame that accompanies loneliness is a social one. It's not a theological one. A sense of having failed where so many seem to succeed and succeed so easily. My second caveat concerns any neat alignment between loneliness and social isolation. Some of the loneliest people I have met are married and have families. And solitude, as a voluntary withdrawal, can actually intensify the quality of personal relationships. Friendships, family relations, even passing encounters can become invested with great value. Loneliness can issue from the poor quality, not just the non-existence of these relations. In fact, the more social expectations impact relations, sometimes intimacy becomes an intensifier of isolation. And I chuckle, though grimly, when I see Banksy's cartoon of a young couple embracing, looking over each other's shoulders into their mobile phones. And I see that kind of behavior in every restaurant I ever go to. Let's turn the condition then of being lonely 180 degrees. Let's begin by viewing it from a scriptural perspective, picking up that text from Isaiah. I have called you by name. You are mine. This is where I would focus a theological anthropology. We are known by God because we have been named by God. And what that name is, we have to discover, because it doesn't necessarily accord with our given names, as Abraham, Jacob, Peter, and Paul all came to see. To seek that true name, the name given to us which only Christ and we know, according to the book of Revelation, is to embark on a journey to know even as we are known. And if that notion comes towards the end of St. Paul's paean to love in 1 Corinthians 13, that's because this is a journey into love, a journey in which we learn what love is, even self-love, and how to practice it. Harold Bloom, writing a preface to Henry Corbin's celebrated study of Sufism, Alone with the Alone, writes, "Descending to the deepest self is so difficult that I have arrived there 2 or 3 times only in 2/3 of a century. In that fullness where we know as we are known, our diseases of will and of intellect cease to trouble us." That's Bloom. The desert fathers and mothers, the Celtic monks, all spoke of the peregrinatio pro Dei amore, where peregrinatio is not just pilgrimage, it's exile. And like the refugees today, seeking a home outside their home. Isaiah speaks of a calling of this name that stretches out the individual's desire towards profundity as deep calls to deep. This is not an empty calling, ignorable, soliciting, but what a social theorist, Louis Althusser, understood as interpellation. Althusser gives 2 examples of interpellation, and I want to use them as analogies to explore divine calling. His first is dramatically political, and that is the interpellation he wishes to pursue. You're walking down a street. I don't know whether anyone walks around the street in America, but anyway, in Britain it happens all the time. You're walking down a street, and when a policeman shouts, "Hey, you!" and you're frozen in such a hailing, your identity and subjectivity brought into question, not just before a man in a uniform, but what Althusser will describe as a whole state apparatus you have been enculturated to obey and respond to. But the second interpellation, which he doesn't really develop at all, is a friend. When you're knocking at the door of a friend's house and your name is being called out as a welcome as the door opens. Now, what I want to take from both these encounters with being called is that responding entails being drawn into the gravity of an engagement. Both interpellations bestow an identity. One negative, you. One positive, you. The negative interpellation empties you. You stand naked before an authority and under question. The gravity repels and alienates as a vast, unnavigable distance opens up. The positive interpellation puts you into a relation that has a reciprocity about it, an invitation to a more intimate knowing and all the mystery of friendship. Why am I drawn to this person rather than that? You are affirmed and accepted in all your complexity and individuality. As with all analogies, when we transpose interpellation with respect to God's calling by a name known only and given to us alone, there's a greater dissimilarity with respect to any similarity we might draw. But first, what I want to do is to explore that gravitational pull towards what yet has to be revealed so that we can know even as we are known. And I suggest we enter the force fields of our desire along with God's desire for us. And that returns us to the theme of Paul's paean of love. Its depth, its mystery, its heartache, and its spirituality. And we'll also return to Bloom's observation of how difficult plumbing those gravitational fields actually is. For to name one's desire requires a lifetime of soul searching. The question is often asked bluntly in the Psalms, just as it appears frequently in the Gospels, even though the disciples are often told whatever they ask in Jesus' name will be done for them. It takes the form of a question. What do you desire that I should do for you? This difficulty in naming what we're really desiring in our desires is made more complex by what we mean by desire. Despite the heavy work desire does as a word throughout the history of Christian spirituality, what desire is actually remains opaque. What motivates us? What are the physiological and psychological structures of motivation? Now, I've dealt with that elsewhere, and I don't want to go through that this evening beyond saying desire animates because it seeks. It seeks fulfillment from what it believes will fulfill it. In that seeking, relationality is established, even if the object of desire is a placeholder rather than what is desired itself. Now, let me just explain that. The claim arises because experience teaches us, and psychoanalysis has examined the experience, that possessing the object provides only momentary satisfaction. If psychoanalysis speaks in terms of displacement, projection, transference, and denial, it's only speaking of the way the object desired in desiring is elusive. What is actually being sought in desire's seeking? Now, I'm not either going to go into the psychoanalysis, and there may be others better qualified here tonight than I am to do that. What I want to point towards is that gravitational field that we're drawn into that solicits and animates our desiring and makes it difficult to name exactly what it is that is being desired. But what it is definitely relational and amorous. I'm going to give a scriptural example here of Jesus' arrest in the Garden of Gethsemane. And don't worry about loneliness. We're going to come back because this is the groundwork for thinking about the loneliness. In the darkness that follows the Last Supper and the arrival of what Jesus calls the hour, a haunting question is called out to a band of armed men and officers from the chief priests and Pharisees. Whom do you seek? He is the object of their desire in more ways than they themselves are aware. They want to capture him, though they're unsure who he is among the other disciples with him. So Jesus has to point him out. Now, the verb to seek is in the present, continuous, and active tense. The verb of direct speech as distinct from the narrative of a past action. It's a question, I would argue, at the very heart of the call of God, which is nothing more and nothing less than the desire of God for us. It's relational and it's amorous. It sets up the gravitational field in which encounter takes place. Jesus of Nazareth, they answer. I am he. In Greek, ego eimi, the name God gives himself to Moses when he calls to him from the burning bush. Here then is the full presence of the divinity in the present tense and eternal, ego eimi. And the narrative continues, as soon then as he has said to them, I am he, they went backward and fell on the ground. The question is repeated by Christ, fully God, fully human, whom do you seek? The betrayal of Judas cuts straight and destructively through the gravitational field. For this prostration, this worship stops nothing. Jesus will be arrested and finally killed. The processes of secular and political time have their own logic, animated by various powers, shared, contested, resisted. Jesus' hour in its coming and its effect can impact these logic, but only by consent, reception, belief. The ego eimi stands there, solicits, whom do you seek? But it will not command. It has no need to command because the obedience that is solicited, which in both Greek and Hebrew is related to the verb to obey, is a submission to the gravitational field that interpolation establishes as both relational and amorous. From the psychoanalytical perspective, and much of the work of well-being and mindfulness that follows it, I have to take control. And that I, that ego, is as solid and material as the doorpost and lintel of a house. The verse from Isaiah annuls that self-possession. And this is at the heart of Jesus' ego eimi, which is both a challenge and an invitation offered in the question, whom do you seek? I have called you by name. You are mine. You are mine. The God who calls, the interpolation of that calling, the gravitational force that is both relational and amorous in configuring it, is far more inner than the soul or psyche. It is far more inner than the precariousness of hyper-individualism. An interior depth of selfhood is being plumbed and requires our participation in that plumbing because it goes beneath and beyond cognition, consciousness, even unconsciousness. This is what Kierkegaard called spirit, taken from St. Paul. For what person knows the thoughts and motives of a human being except the human being's spirit within them? So also, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now let me be clear. What I'm suggesting here is that spiritual formation issues from an engagement of the human spirit with the Spirit of God. And that is, of course, to theologians as obvious as it is profound. But the engagement I am arguing is with respect to knowing the name by which we are called, the name only we have been given in our created being, a name only Christ knows, but which we increasingly come to understand in and through our formation, which is in and through our salvation, in which we come to know even as we are known. What we come to know is our uniqueness in hidden with Christ in God. We learn what it is we are desiring in our desire, who it is we seek in our seeking, and that there is a goal and end to just endless seeking for itself. And in entering that gravitational field, the desire which animates is transformed. We learn to love as we are loved. Now, I could say much more about that love and what I often call as love unknown, as divine love, and want to use the word agape here. But I want to focus on what is absolutely essential here, absolutely essential to that process of interpolation, the gravitational force field it establishes, and the relational amorousness it generates. What is absolutely essential is isolation. We need to be alone. As Jacob was alone when he encountered God at the ford of Jabbok, when he discovered both his true name and his destiny. No one else can participate in this encounter for us, just as no one else can experience our deaths or our pains, despite mirror neurons and empathetic skills. Solitude is essential because I have called you by name. You are mine. Who and what we are is hidden with Christ in God, as Paul says in Colossians. And this means, in fact, ironically, we are never alone, even when we feel alone, because we are always known. And in our deepest level of being, we know we are known. It would follow from that prayer is not something we do, it's something we are as creatures responding, appealing to a perpetual appeal. Being only, which from the 19th century coined the word lonely, being only makes possible the appropriation of salvation in Christ. Our ability to stand alone, to be distinct, is the precondition for our salvation, which is the work of formation. Back to loneliness. Our being alone is an existential corollary of our being created, the uniqueness of our being created by name. The Jewish and Islamic mystics, in having a strict monotheism as distinct from the Christian Trinitarian understanding of God, will speak of being alone with the alone. That needs qualification within the Christian tradition, for even when Christ went up the mountain to pray alone, he was never alone. But what is obvious is loneliness is not a sin. No guilt and shame should be attached to loneliness. But bearing in mind the first of my caveats, it is not theologically to be simply understood as some opportunity for conversion. There are deeper anthropological roots to loneliness that need to be understood. And solitude, as saints like St. John of the Cross testify, can be terrifying. I described loneliness as a social pathology. And whatever the theological framing of that anthropology, it needs to be understood and examined in social terms, for that too is how we are created. And that means examining not just the ideology of secularism, but the operations of its emotional and psychological effects, such as the general decline in our ability to trust. The book that profoundly, and I'm coming to a close here, the book that most profoundly explores this for me is the American classic, written at 22 by Carson McCullers, The Heart is a Lonely Hunter. McCullers opens the novel with a startling contrast. On the one hand, there are two men, one Greek and overweight, one American, tall and culturally refined, both of them mutes. Despite the differences, they live together and now have no other friends except when they worked. And because they were alone so much, nothing ever disturbed them. That's the author. On the other hand, we have the working poor of a small town in the deep south, where, to quote, often in their faces along the streets, there was a desperate look of hunger and loneliness. The hunger has explanatory power with respect to what that other metaphor McCullers employs, the heart as a hunter. Desire, again. For a moment, a little more of the plot. For the opening chapter sees Spiros Anthropopoulos, the Greek, separated from John Singer, his friend following the onset of a mania that leads his cousin to have him placed in a mental asylum 200 miles away. What follows is an imaginative exploration of the ways in which lonely, alienated, poor, isolated people, some of them in families and forming intimate relationships, cope with living around John Singer. And one of those ways of coping is turning the outcast Singer into a screen for messianic projections. So he becomes a Christ figure, generous, caring, forgiving man who listens, advises, is sought out as somebody above the desperate look of hunger and loneliness that the citizens of that small town inhabit. Only the irony throughout is that Singer poses a riddle that captures their imaginations, makes them forget, even rise above the meanness and the meaninglessness that haunts them, and focuses the bitterness of their loneliness. And the riddle comes apart. Singer commits suicide when his friend dies. As the people who have come to see him as more than themselves gather at the open, dank grave, the sun burning down on them in savage heat, they stare in desperation. Kierkegaard would say self-desperation. They work, they get through, they cope with things. Time passes. Biff, who actually manages Singer's funeral, concludes the novel. Alone in his shop, he saw a glimpse of human struggle and of valor, of the endless fluid passage of humanity through endless time, and of those who labor and of those who, in one word, love. But the illumination passes as he feels a shaft of terror, a future of blackness, error, ruin. He was suspended between radiance and darkness. He composed himself soberly to await the morning sun. To my mind, no sociological or psychological reflection on loneliness can offer us the depth of existential insight here into the human condition. Loneliness is not just an emotion, as Alberti and others think. Loneliness is a certain poverty. It's out of loneliness and poverty that McCullers writes. People hunting for intimacy, for love and to be loved. If Christian theology has a reading of this hunger and hunting, and I say reading, not answer, not solution, because doctrines and practices of the church cannot be used as sticking plasters and splints. It must imaginatively reach down into the condition of loneliness as a human condition. And that means engaging with it socially, pastorally, empathetically, imaginatively. Ultimately, what such an engagement will encounter is Christ's dereliction on the cross, forsakenness. Loneliness is a profound recognition of forsakenness. Christian faith must listen, hunger, hunt, strain for, yearn, to hear those words in this forsakenness and all the actions that follow from it and perpetrated that God speaks to Isaiah. I have called you by name, you are mine. For we are each before God ultimately alone, but we are also in that known. Thank you.
Our thanks to Graham Ward for that wonderful talk. If you have a question, we have a little time for questions. Please raise your hand. Avi or I will walk to you with the mic so that everyone can hear what you have to ask.
Thank you for your talk. Do you know the Beatles song, Eleanor Rigby?
Yeah.
I was thinking about this song on the way to the lecture tonight. For the audience, there's a line in the song that goes, where do all the lonely people come from? Where do they all belong? And it describes two characters, Eleanor Rigby and Father Mackenzie, the loneliness in their lives. But I was thinking about two lines in the song. One that says, nobody came to Eleanor Rigby's funeral.
Yeah.
And then the other line after that, no one was saved after Father Mackenzie couldn't give his sermon to anyone. What do you think about that connection between no one came and no one was saved?
Yeah, what a beautiful question. Eleanor Rigby is often used in the materials on loneliness to actually draw attention to the way in which this actually works itself out, even though it may not be in terms of Liverpool Catholicism and Father Mackenzie, where the song is actually set. There's a profound question there about community. And there's a profound question in what I've been saying about the relationship between we are created, and that makes us totally individual, but we are created in community. And it's the way in which those two things come together that seems to me to be about the way in which formation and salvation happened. And in a sense, what Eleanor Rigby, the song and the lyrics are about, is about lovelessness, forsakenness and lovelessness, that no one loved, she had no one who was loving her. And that therefore, that kind of desire for what we want, that's a human desire, the desire to love and be loved, through which we come to understand our own self and love that own self as distinctive, and have someone else hold the complexity of who we are as a unique creation that no one else can replace, that's actually there, that actually is really important. I'll just offer you one more reflection here, which is just one of the most profound liturgies I've been involved in, is the liturgy for All Souls Day. Because then, the liturgy I know well is that people come and they come with a candle at a certain part in the liturgy. And it always strikes me, as the priest at the other end, it doesn't matter how long ago their loved one died, or it could have been a week, could have been 50 years. That love still there. It's holding. There's a holding in that love of the distinctiveness of that person that no one can replace. And that's what they want to come and make a memorial of, that irreplaceability of that person and that connection with that love. But it's that connection between that and also that connection with our need for each other, because no one will be saved. We are not saved on our own. It's just that our salvation is appropriated by actually entering into the gravitational field of that relationality and amorous with the divine. But that has also to be worked out in our communities, and in recognizing that actually that we are part of something that's bigger. That's why we can be self-dispossessed, because there's something bigger than us.
Thank you for coming and speaking with us today. Two things that came to mind. One is the monastic tradition and how loneliness and aloneness is something, as you pointed out, essential for kind of religious development. And that kind of community in contrast with young adults on a college campus, which I've also witnessed here, loneliness is extremely prevalent. Do you see a connection with people who experience aloneness or loneliness, both kinds, in these kind of maybe like monastic or religious circles versus like secular universities or just universities in general?
There is a connection. The difficulty is not to try and give some kind of flippant answer to it. I see it very much, or saw it very much in Oxford, because Oxford University college life pretty much, I mean, I've only been around the campus today, so I'm but pretty much, you know, there's something that is built upon a monastic but the framework's not there anymore. You know, the narrative framework's not there in how this might function. And there's a deep suspicion at the same time of anything that's an authority that you know, actually might be official, institutional kind of sense. So there's a real kind of, you know, difficulty going on. I think one of the most difficult ones, I think that's doing this, if you like, and it really becomes really quite difficult. You know, people like me want to try and understand something of the theological framework, but actually the institution that theology is even part of is under question. What are we? Are we in the university? Are we in the church? I mean, I can only speak on behalf of the Anglican Church. The Anglican Church doesn't know what to do with academics. It certainly doesn't want them talking and bringing theological frameworks, all right? You could do something far better, like just organize some parties or whatever, right? But that's exactly not going to answer the question. It's not going to answer the deep kind of sense of feeling alienated from the institution itself. And then, so you've got all these people together, and there's nothing holding them together. Alongside that, what you've got is the growth of, you know, the individualism and the success. So everyone looks like one of the most interesting finds from the research I've been doing, sociological research, is actually online loneliness, because it's not, during COVID we learnt to be online much more and now we can't get out of the habit of being online, so all that. No, but it was trying to dig deeper at what's going on in the online loneliness, and they came up with, and this is a word you will probably know, that I have called FOMO, right? And that FOMO is, you know, the fear of missing out is one of the largest kind of senses that, in fact, everyone's having a good time except me, you know. And that kind of generation of, now, it's those kinds of things that obviously the monastic tradition never had to deal with. But there is no, you know, the sociological analysis can do something about it, but you can even make you aware about it. That doesn't stop the experience or the feeling about it. And so how do you create those? I mean, the only way and I'm here now trying to offer solutions, and I don't want to offer solutions, but the only way in which you actually get people together that form secular communities that work through things like that are something like AA. People who come together to actually express their need and the cravings they have and the behaviors they get into because of the cravings they have and the need they have, which is not being, you know, which requires that first stage of what I was talking about. It requires innerness. It requires that first kind of, it's not yet I am created, but it is a kind of innerness that who am I? What am I? Why am I here? What am I doing here? These are the basic questions of theological anthropology as well.
Thank you, Professor Ward. Going back to Father Mackenzie, the point of the song is that the ministry of the church is futile. And for those of us who are priests and have shepherded communities, what would be the implications of your thinking for parish ministry, particularly because the challenge of a parish priest is precisely to create community? And I'm trying to think, how would you preach that?
It's a really good question. I'm going to give you an anecdote, right? It's not an answer. I once took a parish away to Israel for a pilgrimage, and the priest of the parish church, because I was just doing the organising, came with us. And one night after everyone else had gone to bed, we opened a bottle of scotch and sat talking about things. And eventually he said to me, you know, Graham, I have been 35 years in this parish. I don't see any formation in any of the people I've worked with. And there was no answer that I could give to that. It may have been a wrong perception. It may have been, how do you know, kind of question. But there is something also about the way in which he, like I, like those of us in the church, are called not to be the successes. We're not called to yes, we are called to create community, but if there is no community that's there to be created, then that is not necessarily our failure, all right? Our failure would be not to be in that situation and obeying the call. That would be our failure. But as I said, I'm not here to give solutions. What always happens in these kind of, you go into a pastoral, and they always, I was with all the bishops at Lambeth once, when they just talked about the church is going into ruins, it's all going to go, down, it's going downhill, we just don't know where we're going, and we're getting financially bankrupt, and, so what would you do? What would you say to us to answer this question? And I just said, I haven't got a clue. At the end of the day, we preach the gospel. That's the baseline. We preach the gospel. I haven't got any answers for those kind of questions. There are handbooks on how you can turn around a parish and make it successful. I don't want anything to do with them, I'm afraid. Sorry, there was a question.
Yes, let's take
Sorry,
one more.
I feel as I've not answered that question at all and ditched it because I don't know the answer to the question. I really don't. I see the issue, I see the problem. I do not know how you answer that question, but I see priests week after week after week just doing the thing that they've got to do. And there's nothing else that's a testimony to faithfulness to me.
Question.
Thank you very much for your talk. You're obviously a very deep thinker. And I'm just sitting here, having just gotten back from sunny Australia, and I'm thinking of you living in that place on an island in Western Scotland, and I'm wondering, do you like it? Just simply question. I just want to ask a very simple question, like, do you feel like you need that environment to do all your brainy thought work and all that, or do you ever have any fun? Do you ever get in the sun?
That's a great question. I think I'm going to go back tonight and think, do I ever have any fun? There is a lot of self-isolation, but as I say, sometimes that isolation can actually make encounters, even small encounters, really meaningful, that when you actually do meet with someone, there's a real listening that goes on, a real relating, and you feel it part of, the other thing is you're constantly having to share as a community that you've got no power, or that, your ex's roof has blown in, or whatever. So there's always a kind of sense, and they're not fun things, but it is. What there is there is a sense of your connectedness with something that's so much bigger than yourself, because the land, everything around you, creative-wise, the weather can determine what I do that day. But I'm going to take that home. I'm going to sit there tonight and think, you're going to get some fun back into your life somewhere.